There is a grave in northern Georgia that doesn't make sense. It sits beneath a platform mound 60 feet high. The mound was built by thousands of hands over hundreds of years. The people who built it traded copper from the Great Lakes and shells from the Gulf of Mexico. They fed cities. They buried their dead with gold and ceremony. They were, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated civilizations in North American history. And then they vanished. Not slowly, not over generations. In archaeological terms, almost overnight. The grave is still there. The mound is still there. But the people who built them? Gone. Replaced within a century by communities that organized themselves completely differently, spoke different languages, had different pottery, different burial practices, different everything. And the strangest part is not that the old civilization disappeared. The strangest part is what replaced it. Because what came after wasn't chaos, it wasn't emptiness. What came after was something that had never existed before. A nation assembled deliberately, piece by piece, from the survivors of dozens of other nations that had already been destroyed. Historians called them the Creek. The people themselves had a different name, the Muscogee. And their story, the real story, the one the DNA is now telling, is unlike anything in the history of this continent. Let's start with what most people think they know. The standard version goes like this. The Creek Indians were the descendants of the great Mississippian mound builders. A civilization that had stood for 500 years gradually reorganized itself as European contact changed the political landscape. Same people, new structure, continuous history from ancient mound to modern tribal nation. It's a clean story. It's taught in schools. It appears in textbooks. It's also, the evidence increasingly suggests, not quite true. Here's the problem. If the Muscogee were simply the Mississippian people reorganized, their own oral traditions would reflect that. You would expect stories of one homeland, one origin, one people who stayed in place while the world changed around them. Instead, Muscogee oral tradition preserves something far stranger. Multiple migration accounts, stories of different town groups arriving from completely different directions. Some from the west, some claiming separate points of origin entirely. Groups that had no original reason to call themselves the same people, describing the moment they came together not as a return to something old, but as the creation of something new. It doesn't read like one people's memory of their own continuous history. It reads like the memory of a merger. So what actually happened? To understand the Muscogee, you have to understand what the world of the American Southeast looked like in the century and a half after European contact. And the honest answer is, it looked like the end of everything. Begin with disease. When Hernando de Soto's expedition marched through the Mississippian Southeast in 1539, it didn't just pass through. It left something behind. European pathogens, smallpox, measles, influenza, moved through indigenous populations that had never been exposed to them. Populations with zero immunity, zero resistance. Mortality estimates for some communities run catastrophically high. Entire chiefdoms, political structures that had taken centuries to build, collapsed within a single generation. Not because of war, not because of conquest, because of invisible particles that nobody could see, name, or stop. But disease was only the beginning. Here is the part of this story that almost never makes it into the standard history: the Indian slave trade. Beginning in the late 1600s, English colonists in Carolina built a commercial economy substantially fueled by one thing: capturing indigenous people and selling them. Not dozens, not hundreds. Tens of thousands of individuals, bought and sold, shipped to Caribbean plantations, or put to work in colonial households up and down the Atlantic coast. And here is what made it so devastating. The English didn't do the capturing themselves. They didn't have to. They offered guns, the most valuable technology in a suddenly destabilized world, in exchange for captives. So indigenous nations were drawn into the trade as both victims and, at times, as raiders themselves, trading captives for weapons in an arms race that no single chiefdom could win and no single chiefdom could opt out of without becoming the next target. The historian Robbie Etheridge gave this period a name that has become foundational to how scholars now understand it: the Mississippian shatter zone. a roughly two-century span from the 1540s to about 1730, during which disease, slave raiding, and the collapse of established political authority fed each other in a grinding generational loop, sweeping through what is now Georgia, Alabama, the Carolinas, Florida, Tennessee, a loop that no single Mississippian chiefdom could survive intact. By the early 1700s, the old mound-building world was gone. Not weakened, not diminished, gone. And here is where the story turns into something that no historian expected. The people who survived the shatter zone did not simply vanish. They did not scatter into isolated, struggling remnants and slowly disappear. They did something almost paradoxical. They came back together, not as the people they had been, as something new. The technical term scholars use is coalescent societies. These weren't reconstituted versions of the old chiefdoms. They were new societies built deliberately from survivors of many different, often completely unrelated groups who pulled together for protection, for trade leverage, for sheer demographic survival in a world now crowded with English, French, and Spanish colonial powers all competing for influence. The Muscogee Creek Confederacy was not one nation that endured. It was dozens of nations, Coosa, Abihka, Tallapoosa, Apalachicola, and many smaller groups whose names barely survive in the historical record, that fused into a single political structure out of pure necessity. Not ancestry, not shared bloodline, not even shared language. Necessity. And here is what you have to stop and let sit for a moment. Most nations, when we trace them backward, eventually arrive at some founding population, some original group that everything else grew from. The Muscogee don't have that story. Their founding story is the opposite. It's not one group spreading out. It's dozens of groups, shattered, scattered, decimated, deliberately choosing to come together and call themselves one people. That choice is what the DNA is now recording, and what the DNA found when scientists started actually reading the bones. From the mound sites, from the river valleys, from the burial grounds of both the Mississippian world and the world that replaced it, didn't just confirm the coalescent model. It made it even stranger. Because here is what the genetics shows. In multiple river valleys across the southeast, the maternal genetic lineages present in the soil before the shatter zone do not cleanly match the lineages of the people living in those same valleys a century or two later. The populations are different, measurably, provably different, not because one group was wiped out and replaced by invaders, but because the survivors who came together to build the Muscogee Confederacy came from enough different places, with enough different ancestral backgrounds, that the genetic signal of the new nation looks fundamentally unlike the signal of any single one of its predecessors. The DNA is not showing you one people's continuous history. It's showing you the moment a new people was invented. At Etowah, the great mound city in northern Georgia, researchers examining the site's later history found something striking. The genetic record lacks the kind of population-specific markers that would let scientists draw a clean, direct biological line from the mound builders of Etowah to any single modern nation, creek or otherwise. The science cannot hand you a simple chain. These exact people became those exact people. What it can show you is the deeper pattern: repeated, region-wide movement, mixture, reorganization. The absence of a clean genetic line is not a gap in the evidence. It is the evidence. There's a test that linguists use when they want to understand how a nation actually formed. Not a genetic test, not an archaeological test, a language test. The idea is simple. If a nation grew from one original population, one group that stayed in one place and slowly built a culture over time, its people will speak one language, or dialects of one language, variations that all trace back to the same root. But if a nation was assembled from separate groups that had no original connection to each other, if it was built from the wreckage of a catastrophe, then the languages inside it will tell a completely different story. They won't be dialects of the same root. They'll be fingerprints of completely separate origins. Now apply that test to the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, and the result should stop you cold. Inside the 18th century Creek Confederacy, the following languages were spoken side by side as living, active community languages. Muscogee itself, the language that gave the nation its name. Hitchiti, also Muscogean, but distinct enough from Muscogee that speakers of the two languages could not automatically understand each other. A separate language, not a dialect. Alabama. Another Muscogean language, again distinct, again spoken by communities that governed themselves under the Creek Confederacy while maintaining their own linguistic identity completely intact. Coasati. Related to Alabama. A fourth distinct language operating inside the same political structure. And then, the one that breaks the model entirely. Yuchi. Yuchi is a language isolate. That phrase sounds technical. What it actually means is this. Yuchi is not related to any other known language on Earth. Not to Muscogean. Not to any other Native American language family. Not to anything spoken anywhere else in the world that linguists have been able to connect it to. It stands completely alone. The Yuchi people who spoke it were not a splinter group of the Muscogee. They were not a distant cousin of the Hitchiti. They were not, by any linguistic measure, related to any of the other communities inside the Creek Confederacy at all. They were a completely separate people, with a completely separate origin, with a language that suggests their ancestors had been genetically and culturally isolated for so long that no trace of connection to neighboring populations survived in their speech. And they were full members of the Creek Confederacy, sitting in council with Muscogee speakers and Hitchiti speakers and Alabama speakers, governing together, fighting together, calling themselves, when the English asked, part of the same nation. Ask yourself what this means for the standard model. If the Creek Confederacy were simply the Mississippian people reorganized, one original population adapting to new circumstances, how do you explain the Yuchi? You can't. A single origin population doesn't spontaneously develop a language isolate inside itself. Languages don't work that way. A language isolate represents a lineage of human beings who were separated from all other populations for a very long time, long enough that every linguistic connection to other groups was severed completely. The Yuchi didn't grow out of the Muscogee world. They arrived in it, from somewhere else, from a history that the standard model of Creek origins has no framework to accommodate. And yet there they were, at the center of the Confederacy, which means the Confederacy was not built on shared ancestry, it was built on something else entirely. Now let's add the genetic layer. Mitochondrial DNA research, the kind that traces maternal lineages, has been conducted on skeletal remains from multiple sites across the Mississippian Southeast, sites in Georgia, sites in Alabama, sites in the river valleys where the Creek Confederacy eventually took shape. And the pattern that keeps appearing is population discontinuity. In valley after valley, the maternal lineages present in the ground before the shatter zone do not cleanly match the lineages of the communities that formed in those same valleys afterward. The genetic signal changes, not completely, there is continuity in some lineages, but the overall profile shifts, measurably, consistently, in a way that tells you new people were moving in, from different places, with different ancestral backgrounds, and mixing with the survivors who stayed. This is exactly what you would expect from the coalescent model. When researchers look at the specific genetic signatures present in the historic Creek period, they find a level of diversity that is unusual even by the standards of coalescent societies. Not just diversity between different town groups, diversity within towns, within families. A genetic mosaic that reflects not one or two founding populations coming together, but many, spread across enough geographic and temporal distance that the mixing happened in waves, not all at once. What this tells geneticists is that the Muscogee Confederacy was not assembled in a single moment of coalition building. It was built over time, continuously. Wave after wave of shattered communities finding the Confederacy and joining it. The Confederacy was not a fixed alliance that formed once and then maintained itself. It was a machine for making new people out of broken ones. And that machine ran for over a century. The foundational academic work on the coalescent society model is Robbie Etheridge's research on the Mississippian shatter zone, available through most university library systems for free. The genetic studies on Mississippian-era remains are available on PubMed and bioRxiv. For the linguistic evidence on Yuchi specifically, the work of Mary Lynn at the University of Oklahoma is the most accessible entry point. That's your free foundation. All of it publicly available, all of it real. But if you want a structured framework for understanding how coalescent societies form, how to read genetic diversity data without a PhD, and how the Muscogee story fits into the broader pattern of indigenous nation building across the Americas, I've built something that walks through exactly that, step by step. The link is in the description. Check it out, but stay here, because what comes next is the part of this story that changes everything you thought you understood about identity itself. Because we haven't talked yet about what happened when the Confederacy's definition of belonging was pushed to its absolute limit. When the Creek absorbed not just other native peoples, not just linguistic strangers, but people who, by every standard of the colonial world surrounding them, were supposed to be the enemy. And what that produced is a second nation, built from the same template, in a single lifetime. There is a moment in history when a nation stops being an alliance and becomes something else. Something with its own gravity, its own logic, its own ability to pull people in from outside and transform them into something they weren't before. The Creek Confederacy reached that moment sometime in the mid-18th century, and what it produced, almost as a byproduct of its own internal logic, was one of the most remarkable acts of nation creation in the history of the Americas. Not a conquest, not a migration, not a founding myth built around a single heroic ancestor, a deliberate, repeated generational choice to keep becoming something new. The people who made that choice called themselves Seminole. Seminole. The word itself is a clue. It derives through a chain of borrowings that runs from Spanish through Muscogee, from a term meaning something close to wild or runaway. People who left, people who went to the frontier. And that is exactly what the first Seminole were. Beginning roughly in the 1760s, groups of Lower Creek towns began pushing further south, into the Florida Peninsula, into territory that the Spanish nominally controlled but effectively did not govern, into land that had been largely depopulated by the same epidemic catastrophes that had shattered the Mississippian world a century and a half earlier. Florida in the mid-18th century was, in demographic terms, almost empty. The great Timucua civilization that had once occupied the peninsula had been reduced by disease and Spanish colonial violence to near extinction. The Calusa of the southern coast were effectively gone. The land was there. The people who had lived on it for thousands of years were not. Into that space came the Creek migrants, and what they did with it is where the genetics becomes extraordinary. Because the Creek migrants who pushed into Florida did not find an empty world. Not entirely. They found remnants, small surviving communities of Florida's original peoples, fragments of the Timucua, survivors of smaller groups whose names barely appear in the Spanish records, people who had endured the catastrophe but had no political structure left to belong to. The Creek migrants absorbed them, not through conquest, through the same mechanism that had built the Confederacy itself. Intermarriage, clan adoption, the gradual incorporation of outsiders into a social structure flexible enough to hold them. The genetic signal of these original Florida peoples, faint, nearly erased by the demographic collapse they had survived, shows up in the mitochondrial DNA of Seminole communities. A maternal lineage thread connecting the new nation to the oldest human presence in the Florida Peninsula. It's barely there, but it's there. The Seminole didn't erase the people who came before them. They absorbed what was left, and in doing so, they carried those lineages forward into a future that the original Florida peoples would never have survived to reach alone. But here is where the Seminole story becomes something that no standard model of indigenous history can fully account for. Because the Creek migrants and the Florida remnant populations were not the only people who ended up inside the emerging Seminole world. There was a third group, escaped African slaves. Florida at this period was contested colonial territory. The Spanish had it. The British had taken it. The Spanish had it back. The Americans wanted it. And in the gaps between those shifting authorities, something happened that the colonial powers on all sides found deeply threatening. African people who had escaped slavery in British and American territories were making their way to Florida. Not in ones and twos, in significant numbers. The Spanish had a formal policy, established as early as 1789, of granting freedom to enslaved people who escaped from British territory and reached Spanish Florida. So they came, through swamps, through hostile territory, at enormous personal risk. And when they arrived in Florida, they encountered the Seminole. Some African individuals were technically held in a form of bondage by Seminole communities, but a form so different from chattel slavery as practiced by American colonists that the word bondage barely applies. They lived in their own towns, they governed themselves, they kept their own produce, they intermarried with Seminole families, they served as interpreters and diplomats and military advisors. Others were simply free members of Seminole communities, no formal status distinction at all. And over time, through those intermarriages, through those shared children, through the shared experience of fighting the same enemies, the genetic boundary between African-descended and Seminole-descended communities in Florida began to blur. The DNA record of Seminole communities today carries the evidence of this. African genetic ancestry, measurable and present, woven into the genomic profile of a nation that began as a Creek offshoot and became something neither Creek nor African, but genuinely, irreducibly its own. In roughly 60 years, from the 1760s to the 1820s, Creek communities pushed south into depopulated Florida, absorbed remnant populations of the original Florida peoples, incorporated escaped African individuals and communities, intermarried across all of these groups, and out of that process emerged a distinct identity, a distinct political structure, a distinct way of understanding who they were. The Seminole, a nation that was not Creek, not Timucua, not African, not any simple combination of those things, something new, ethnogenesis, the birth of a people, happening in real time, within living memory, using the exact same mechanism that had produced the Creek Confederacy a century earlier. The Muscogee had not just built one nation out of ruins, they had built a template, a repeatable process for turning catastrophe into community. And the Seminole were the proof that the template worked. When the United States government decided in the 1830s to forcibly remove the 5 civilized tribes from the southeast, the Seminole were the only nation that refused to go. Not just resisted, refused, absolutely and violently, and for decades. The result was the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, the longest and most expensive Indian war in American history. The United States Army spent 7 years trying to remove a nation that numbered at most a few thousand people from the swamps of Florida. They failed. A core of the nation retreated into the Everglades and never surrendered, never signed a treaty, never agreed to removal. They are still there. The Seminole tribe of Florida and the Muscogee tribe of Indians of Florida, 2 federally recognized nations, are the direct descendants of the people who refused to leave. The Seminole Wars, seen through this lens, were not just a military conflict. They were the defense of an idea, the idea that a people could build itself on purpose, could decide to exist, could refuse to stop. And the DNA shows that inside the Seminole Nation today, the core Muscogean ancestry, the Florida Peninsula signal, the African ancestry woven into the genomic fabric of communities that have been part of the nation for 200 years. Each layer is a record of a decision, made by individuals from completely different backgrounds to become one people. There is a document in the National Archives in Washington that most Americans have never read. It was written in 1819 by a man named Thomas McKenney, the first head of the Office of Indian Affairs. And in it, McKenney lays out with remarkable clarity what the United States government intended to do with the indigenous nations of the American Southeast. Not remove them. Not yet. First, transform them. The word McKenney used was civilization. The program had a formal name, the Civilization Fund, and a formal budget, approved by Congress, specifically allocated for the purpose of changing the way indigenous people lived, governed themselves, educated their children, organized their families, and understood who they were. The theory was simple. If you could make indigenous people indistinguishable from white American settlers, then the question of their separate national existence would solve itself. They would simply stop being a separate nation, and the land question would resolve itself along the way. What happened instead is one of the most extraordinary stories of cultural resistance in the history of this continent. The Muscogee Creek response to the civilization program was not uniform resistance. It was not uniform accommodation. It was something far more strategically sophisticated than either of those things. Some Creek leaders engaged with the program on their own terms. They adopted elements of American agricultural practice. Some sent children to mission schools. Some wore American-style clothing. But they did this while maintaining, with extraordinary tenacity, the things the civilization program was specifically designed to eliminate: the clan system, the ceremonial life, the Confederate political structure, the languages. Above all, the languages. By the 1820s, after 30 years of the civilization program, the Muscogee Creek Confederacy had not only maintained its internal linguistic diversity, it had, in certain respects, deepened it. The presence of Yuchi speakers inside the Confederacy, the continued use of Hitchiti and Alabama alongside Muscogee proper, the maintenance of distinct town identities that mapped onto distinct linguistic communities. None of this had been erased, because you cannot civilize away a language isolate. You cannot policy a people out of speaking a tongue that is related to nothing else on earth. To erase it, you would have to erase the people who carried it. And that, eventually, is exactly what was attempted. The Indian Removal Act was signed by Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830. The treaty that authorized Creek removal, the Treaty of Shatter, signed in 1832, was obtained through a combination of fraud, coercion, and the deliberate exploitation of divisions inside the Confederacy. The removal itself, which began in earnest in 1836, was catastrophic. Creek people were marched west, in summer heat, without adequate food or water, without proper clothing for the winter that caught them on the road. Families were separated. Elderly people who could not keep pace were left behind. Children died. Estimates of mortality during the Creek removal run between 15 and 25% of the total population. And here is what that means genetically. A population that loses 25% of its members in a short period does not just lose people, it loses genetic diversity. The individuals who die are not a random sample of the population. They are disproportionately the elderly, the carriers of the deepest knowledge, the longest memories, the most ancient lineages. They are the very young, the ones whose genetic line had not yet had the chance to continue. Modern Muscogee Creek genomes carry the mark of this. Researchers studying the genetic diversity of contemporary Muscogee communities find a bottleneck, a point in the past where the effective population size dropped sharply, reducing the diversity of the gene pool in ways that are still measurable today. That bottleneck has a name. It happened in 1836. It happened on a road between Georgia and Oklahoma, and it is written permanently into the DNA of every Muscogee person alive. But here is what makes the genetic story of removal something other than just a record of catastrophe. The Muscogee who survived the march arrived in Indian Territory and did something that the United States government had specifically counted on them not being able to do. They rebuilt, not slowly, not tentatively. Within a decade of arrival in Oklahoma, the Muscogee Creek Nation had re-established a constitutional government, a bicameral legislature, a court system, a school system, a written legal code. The languages were still being spoken, all of them: Muscogee, Hitchiti, Alabama, Coasati, and Yuchi, the isolate, the language related to nothing else on earth, still alive, still being passed from parent to child. The coalescent mechanism had not been destroyed by removal. If anything, the shared experience of catastrophe had strengthened it. In 1861, the Civil War created a crisis inside Indian Territory that split the Creek Nation almost exactly in half. Some Creek leaders signed a treaty with the Confederacy. Others remained loyal to the Union and were driven from their homes in a second forced march, north in winter, toward Union lines in Kansas. A second removal within living memory of the first. The genetic bottleneck of 1861 to 1862 is visible in the data alongside the one from 1836. Two compressions. Two moments where the Creek gene pool was squeezed by catastrophe into a narrower version of what it had been. And still the nation rebuilt. The Dawes Act of 1887 was the policy that historians of indigenous America consider the most destructive single piece of legislation in the entire removal and assimilation era. It broke up the communally held land of indigenous nations in Indian Territory into individual allotments assigned to individual tribal members. The land left over after allotment was declared surplus and open to non-Indian settlement. Within a generation, the Creek Nation had lost the overwhelming majority of the land base it had rebuilt in Indian Territory. But here is what the Dawes Act also did, something that its architects understood perfectly and intended deliberately. It required a census. The Dawes rolls created for the first time a fixed, officially binding list of who was and was not a member of each nation. And in creating that list, the enrollment agents made decisions shaped entirely by the racial categories of early 20th century American law. Categories that had nothing to do with how the Creek Confederacy had ever defined membership. The freedmen, the African-descended members of Creek communities, were enrolled on separate rolls, not as Creek citizens with full rights, as a separate category defined by their African ancestry rather than by their participation in Creek community life, their clan affiliations, their language, their generations of belonging. This was not how the Muscogee had ever understood identity. The Creek model was participation, not bloodline. You belonged because you showed up, because you were part of the community, because a clan had taken you in. The Dawes enrollment replaced that model with an American racial model. And the consequences of that replacement are still being felt today, in an ongoing legal and political conflict over the citizenship rights of Creek freedmen descendants that has reached the United States Supreme Court and has not been finally resolved. Here is what the DNA says about all of this. When researchers analyze the genomes of contemporary Muscogee Creek citizens alongside the genomes of Creek freedmen descendants, they find shared ancestry. Not surprising shared ancestry, the kind you'd expect from two populations that lived near each other for a long time. Deep, specific shared ancestry, the kind that reflects generations of intermarriage, of family connection, of children born to parents from both sides of the line that the Dawes enrollment drew. The genetic boundary that the Dawes Act created between Creek citizens and Creek freedmen was a legal fiction imposed from outside. The DNA shows what actually happened on the ground, in the towns, in the families, across the generations. It shows that the line was always blurry, that the people on both sides of it were, in many cases, already family, already kin, already connected by the specific form of belonging that the Creek Confederacy had always used to define membership. Not race, not blood quantum, not the color of a parent's skin. Participation, connection, community. There is a laboratory in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It doesn't look like much from the outside. A building on a university campus. Glass doors, a parking lot. The kind of place you drive past without a second thought. But inside that building, in the last decade, something happened that changed the entire scientific understanding of who the Muscogee Creek people are and where they actually come from. A team of geneticists, working in partnership with enrolled members of the Muscogee Creek Nation, conducted the most comprehensive genomic analysis of Creek ancestry ever attempted. Not a handful of samples. Not a regional study grabbing whoever was available. A structured, community-consented, tribally governed research project that took years to design, years to execute, and produced results that nobody fully expected. The team published their preliminary findings in 2019. And the first thing they found confirmed what the coalescent model had predicted. The second thing they found did not. Let's start with the confirmation. The genomic profile of contemporary Muscogee Creek citizens showed exactly the kind of multi-layered ancestral complexity that the historical and linguistic record had been pointing toward for decades. The researchers identified a core southeastern ancestry component, a genetic signal shared across multiple indigenous nations of the American Southeast that traces back to the pre-contact populations of the region. The mound builders, the Mississippian world, the people who had been in those river valleys before the shatter zone hit. This component was present in every creek sample analyzed, consistent, deep, measurably older than any of the documented historical mixing events, meaning whatever the Creek Confederacy absorbed and incorporated over its 300-year history, it never lost its connection to the ancient southeastern baseline. The mound builders did not entirely disappear from the gene pool. They are still present. in the DNA of people who drive to work in Tulsa and Okmulgee and Muscogee, Oklahoma, people who attend Creek National Council meetings and speak Muscogee and participate in stomp dances that trace their ceremonial logic back further than European contact. The catastrophe of the shatter zone did not erase the oldest southeastern ancestry. It filtered it through the coalescent process and delivered it, changed and blended and accompanied by dozens of other genetic streams, into the present. But here is where the 2019 study produced its unexpected finding. When the researchers ran the full autosomal analysis, the kind that looks at ancestry contributions from all directions, they found something that the coalescent model alone could not account for: a genetic signal with no clean historical explanation. The signal was Great Plains, specifically a genetic component most strongly associated with ancient populations from the central and northern plains. Not the southern plains, not the adjacent Mississippi Valley, the northern plains. Populations ancestrally connected to what is now the Dakotas, Nebraska, the upper Missouri River Basin, in the DNA of people whose documented history was entirely in the southeast. The team checked for contamination, checked for analytical error, ran the numbers again with different software, different reference populations, different statistical frameworks. The signal held. The researchers proposed three possible explanations. The first is ancient population movement that predates the historical record entirely. At some point before any European observer was recording anything in North America, populations with plains ancestry moved into the southeastern river systems and mixed with the people already there. A movement so old that it left only a genetic trace and no cultural footprint visible to archaeology. The second explanation is the Mississippian trade network itself. We know, from the archaeological record, from the distribution of specific artifact types, from the presence of Gulf Coast shells at sites in the Dakotas and Northern Plains, copper at sites in Georgia, that the Mississippian world was connected across enormous distances by trade. Trade means contact. Contact means people moving. People moving means genetic exchange. The third explanation is the most structurally interesting. The coalescent process itself may have brought plains ancestry into the Creek gene pool through a pathway that the historical record doesn't clearly document. If any incoming group carried plains ancestry from earlier movements in their own histories, they would have brought that ancestry with them into the coalescent mix. The Creek Confederacy, by design, did not ask where you came from. It asked whether you would participate. If a community carrying plains genetic ancestry showed up and said yes, the Confederacy took them in, and their DNA became Creek DNA. The research team did not reach a definitive conclusion between these three explanations. What they did conclude is that the Muscogee Creek genome is older and more complex than any previous model had suggested. Not just the coalescent complexity of the historical period. Not just the mixing of southeastern peoples during the shatter zone. Something deeper. Something reaching back further than the Mississippian world itself. The Muscogee are not a nation that was assembled 300 years ago from the pieces of a recent catastrophe. They are a nation that was assembled 300 years ago from pieces that were themselves already ancient, already mixed, already carrying genetic histories reaching back thousands of years before the first mound was built at Etowah. Now let's talk about what this means for the Muscogee Nation today. The Muscogee Creek Nation today is headquartered in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. It has approximately 86,000 enrolled citizens. It operates a court system, a legislature, health clinics, schools, an economic development portfolio that includes multiple business enterprises. It is a functioning government, not a historical artifact, a present reality. In 2020, the United States Supreme Court issued a decision, McGirt versus Oklahoma, that confirmed something the Muscogee Creek Nation had been arguing for over a century. The reservation established for the Creek Nation in Indian Territory had never been legally disestablished. The state of Oklahoma had been exercising criminal jurisdiction over Creek reservation land for over 100 years without legal authority to do so. The reservation, the court held, still existed. The legal and practical consequences of that decision are still unfolding. Criminal jurisdiction, civil law, taxation, land use. The relationship between the Creek Nation and the state of Oklahoma is being renegotiated in real time. The Muscogee Creek Nation has survived disease, slave raiding, removal, the Civil War, the Dawes Act, allotment, assimilation policy, and over a century of state encroachment on its sovereignty. And it is still here, still fighting, still winning, still. And here is the finding from the genetic research that I saved for last. When the Tulsa research team compared the genomic profiles of contemporary Muscogee Creek citizens against the full database of ancient southeastern remains, they were looking for the closest ancient match, the ancient individual whose DNA most resembled a modern Creek person's. What they found was not what they expected. The closest ancient genetic relative of contemporary Muscogee Creek people was not from Georgia, not from Alabama, not from the core territories of the Mississippian world. The closest match came from a burial site in what is now Tennessee, dating to approximately 3,200 years ago. 3,200 years, before the Mississippian culture, before the mound-building era, before any of the political structures that historians have traditionally associated with the Creek ancestors. 3,200 years ago, in what is now Tennessee, a person was buried whose genetic profile most closely resembles the people who today attend Creek National Council meetings in Muscogee, Oklahoma. Let that land for a moment, because what it means is this. The Creek are not 300 years old. They are not 500 years old. They are not 1,000 years old. The genetic thread connecting them to this continent, to the river valleys, to the forests, to the land itself, reaches back over 3,000 years, to a time before anything we call Creek existed. The catastrophe of the shatter zone looked, from inside it, like the end of everything, like the complete destruction of a world. But the DNA says something different. It says the world was not destroyed. It was compressed, reorganized, pushed through a bottleneck so severe that it looked from the outside like erasure. But the thread held. 3,000 years of southeastern ancestry compressed through epidemic and slave raiding and removal and allotment and assimilation, and still present, still readable, still there in the cells of living people who carry it forward without knowing, most of them, exactly what they're carrying. Here is what I want you to take from this. The Muscogee Creek story is not a story about survival despite catastrophe. It is a story about survival through transformation. Every time the world tried to end the Creek, through disease, through slave raiding, through removal, through legal dismemberment, the Creek responded by becoming something new without losing what was essential. The coalescent mechanism that built the Confederacy in the 1700s was the same mechanism that the Seminole used to build a new nation in Florida. It was the same mechanism that sustained the nation through removal and civil war and the Dawes Act. It was the same mechanism that the McGirt decision validated, because a nation that had kept insisting on its own existence for 300 years could point to a treaty and say, "We never stopped. We are still here. The reservation still exists because we never agreed that it didn't." The DNA does not show a people who survived by staying the same. It shows a people who survived by being willing, again and again, to become something new, while holding on to the thread that connected them to what they had been. 3,000 years of that thread, still unbroken, now. Before we close, I want to ask you something directly. Write a number in the comments, 1 through 6, for the finding that stopped you cold. 1. The Yuchi language isolate, a people with no known linguistic relatives at the center of the Creek Confederacy. 2. The 3,200-year Tennessee connection, the ancient ancestor nobody expected. 3. The Seminole as a second act of deliberate nation-building within living memory. 4. The Dawes enrollment creating a racial boundary that the DNA shows never existed biologically. 5. The Plains genetic signal in a southeastern people, and what it implies about movements nobody recorded. 6. The McGirt decision, a 19th century treaty enforced in the 21st century because the nation never stopped insisting it existed. Just a number. I read every comment. You almost certainly know someone who thinks indigenous nations are a thing of the past, who uses the past tense when they talk about Native American peoples and their rights and their land. Someone who doesn't know that a Supreme Court decision in 2020 confirmed that one of the largest reservations in the United States still legally exists. Send them this video. Not to argue, not to lecture, just so they know what actually happened. What is actually happening right now? One share from you might be the reason someone finally understands that the Creek Nation did not end, that it never agreed to end, that the DNA, the history, and the Supreme Court of the United States all confirm the same thing. It is still here. Next week, I'm going into something that will make everything we've discussed look straightforward. There is a burial site in the American Southwest, excavated in the 1980s, reanalyzed with full ancient DNA sequencing in 2022, where the remains show a genetic profile that has sent shockwaves through the field of American archaeology. Not because the DNA is foreign, not because it points to an impossible migration, because it is too old, by several thousand years. The site challenges the entire timeline of human arrival in the Americas. And there is an internal memo from a federal agency dated 2009 that shows the relevant authorities were aware of the dating anomaly 13 years before the DNA results were published. They knew, and they said nothing. Next week, we find out why. I'll see you there.